Bernard Collins had survived a great many things in 69 years. He had survived 3 decades of working as a high school football coach in rural Georgia, which meant he had survived losing seasons and winning seasons, and the particular heartbreak of watching boys he loved make choices he couldn't protect them from. He had survived his wife Patricia's illness, 4 years of it, the slow and merciless kind, and then her death 7 years ago on a Wednesday morning in March when the dogwood outside her window was just beginning to bloom, as if the world had not received the memo about the appropriate weather for grief. He had survived the first year after, which he did not talk about with anyone except his pastor and occasionally his dog, a large and philosophically minded golden retriever named Hank, who had the good sense to simply sit close without offering opinions. He had survived all of these things and come out the other side not bitter, which he considered his greatest accomplishment, greater than the 3 district championships, greater than the community service award the county had given him at retirement, greater than anything with a plaque attached to it. What Bernard had not survived, what had been quietly and thoroughly dismantled by the years, was any expectation that life still had surprises for him. Not bad surprises, not good ones either, simply surprises. He was 69. He knew who he was. He knew his routines and his limits and the particular shape of his days. He woke at 5:30, walked Hank through the neighborhood before the heat came up, drank 2 cups of coffee on the porch, and then spent his mornings the way retired men who have kept their minds active spend their mornings, reading, thinking, tending to the small and satisfying work of a life that no longer required him to be anywhere by a specific time. He was not unhappy. He was not lonely, or so he told himself, with the same conviction and the same slight imprecision with which he had told himself this for 7 years. He was settled. And then, on a Thursday morning in late September, he walked into the public library to return 2 books and check out 2 more, and everything that was settled shifted, without warning, like furniture rearranging itself in a room he thought he knew perfectly. The Millbrook Public Library was a place Bernard had loved since boyhood. It had the particular smell of old libraries, paper and dust, and the faint suggestion of decades of human curiosity, and a quality of silence that was different from the silence of an empty house. The silence of a library was inhabited silence, full silence, the silence of many minds at work in the same space without needing to announce themselves. He returned his books at the desk, collected his holds, and was making his way toward the armchairs near the window, his preferred reading spot when he had no particular reason to hurry home, when he nearly walked into a woman carrying a tower of books that blocked her view completely. He caught 2 of them before they hit the floor. The woman lowered the remaining stack enough to see over it and said, "Oh goodness, thank you," with the expression of someone who had done this before and was mildly embarrassed but not particularly surprised by themselves. She was perhaps 62 or 63. Bernard was not precise about ages, but he was precise about faces, and hers was the kind that had clearly been striking when young and had become, with time, something more interesting than striking. The face of a person who had thought a great deal and felt a great deal and let both show rather than spending energy concealing them. She had close-cropped, natural grey hair and dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and paint on the back of her left hand in 3 colors that she had clearly not noticed. "I think you might have too many books," Bernard said, handing them back. "I think you might be right," she said, accepting them without embarrassment. "I always do this. I come in for 2 and leave with 8. My name is Celestine." She said it the way people say their name when they are comfortable with themselves, simply, without the social anxiety that makes some people apologize for having a name at all. "Bernard," he said. "Bernard." She tried it, as if checking the fit. "Are you here often?" "Every week or 2, he said. Thursdays, usually. Me too, she said. I can't believe we haven't run into each other before. She looked at the books in his hands. He was still holding the ones he'd caught, he realized. He handed them to her. She glanced at the spines of his holds. Robert Caro, she said, reading the title. That's a serious undertaking. He's worth it, Bernard said. He takes his time, but he earns it. Celestine looked at him over the top of her glasses with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Interested and appraising in equal measure, the way a person looks when they have asked a small question and received an answer that suggests the larger conversation might be worth having. I'm going to sit by the window, she said. If you were heading that way, you're welcome to. Bernard, who had been heading that way, said he was. They sat for nearly an hour, not talking the entire time. They each read or appeared to read in the comfortable parallel of two people who have independently discovered that silence with the right person is not the same as silence alone. But they talked between the reading, about books first, the safe territory of shared enthusiasms. Celestine was a retired art teacher who still painted every morning in a studio she had built in her garage, and she read with the appetite of someone who had spent a career teaching others to see and had never stopped being a student herself. Bernard talked about football, not the wins which he had learnt bored most people, but what coaching had actually been, which was a daily practice of understanding what each individual boy needed in order to become more than he currently was. Celestine listened to this with the kind of attention that is not waiting for its own turn to speak, and said that teaching art had been the same, that the subject was almost beside the point, and the actual work was learning to see each student's specific way of seeing. Bernard thought, privately, that this was one of the better conversations he had had in several years. He noted this with the same careful, unalarmed attention he gave most things. He did not make too much of it. He was 69. He had made peace with his life as it was. He was not the kind of man who threw himself toward possibilities without thinking clearly first. But on the drive home, with Caro on the passenger seat and the September light doing something genuinely beautiful to the pecan trees along Route 9, Bernard found himself thinking about wire-rimmed glasses and paint on the back of a hand and an expression he had not been able to categorize. And Hank, who met him at the door with his usual philosophical equanimity, received more of the story than he had asked for. Bernard went back to the library the following Thursday. Celestine was already there, in the armchair beside the window, with her tower of books, slightly smaller this time, he noted, and she looked up when he walked in the way people look up when they have been, at some level, expecting someone. They sat together again, and the week after that, and the week after that. By the fourth Thursday, something had clarified between them in the wordless way that things clarify between two people who are paying close attention. The conversation had moved deeper, past books and careers, into the territory of actual lives. Patricia came up, carefully and then less carefully. Celestine's own marriage, ended 15 years ago, amicably enough, two people who had grown into different shapes, came up in return. Her daughter in Portland, his son Marcus in Atlanta. Bernard noticed that Celestine asked questions the way a skilled person uses a tool, precisely, with clear purpose, without waste. She never asked questions that were merely social. Everything she asked, she actually wanted to know. And on the fifth Thursday, in the comfortable armchairs by the window of the Millbrook Public Library, Celestine asked him the first question. It came naturally, in the middle of a conversation about regret, which they had arrived at through a winding path that had started with a book she was reading about memory and ended somewhere much more personal. "Do you think about the years you spent coaching," Celestine said, "and wish you had spent them differently? Or do you look back and feel settled with it?" It was a simple enough question on the surface, the kind of question that could be answered in 2 sentences and moved past without damage. Bernard understood, somewhere in the part of him that had spent decades reading situations and people, that this was not a simple question. He took his time. I think about specific moments, he said. Boys I didn't reach, times I let the win matter more than the person. There are a handful of those I carry. I don't think I was wrong to carry them. I think they're worth carrying. They make me more careful. He paused. But the years themselves? No. The years I wouldn't trade, even the hard ones, especially those. Celestine watched him while he said this. Not the polite watching of someone waiting for their turn, but real attention. The kind that takes in not just the words, but everything around them. Why especially the hard ones? She asked. Because those are the ones that told me who I was, Bernard said. When Patricia was sick, I found out things about myself I didn't know before. Some of them were better than I expected. A few were worse, but all of it was true. And I'd rather know the true thing than live comfortably in a version of myself that was never fully tested. Celestine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a good answer." "It's just the honest one," Bernard said. "Those are usually the same thing," she said, and she smiled. Not the pleasant social smile she was perfectly capable of deploying, but the real one, the one that reached her eyes fully and changed her whole face. Bernard did not know, sitting in that armchair, that he had just passed a test. He found out later, much later, what the test had been. But at the time, he simply felt what a man feels when he has said something true to someone who received it as true, which is a particular and irreplaceable satisfaction. He told his son Marcus about Celestine that weekend. Marcus was 43, an architect in Atlanta who had his father's methodical mind and his mother Patricia's warmth, and who had been, in the 7 years since Patricia's death, quietly and consistently encouraging his father toward the idea of a life that still contained the possibility of joy. "Tell me about her," Marcus said. Bernard told him. The library, the books, the paint on her hand, the conversation about coaching, and what it actually was. "She asked you about regret," Marcus said. "She did." "What do you think she was actually asking?" Bernard considered it. "Whether I was a man who had made peace with his life," he said slowly, "or whether I was still fighting it. Whether I was honest enough to admit the hard parts without drowning in them." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She was asking if you were whole," he said. "Not perfect, whole. There's a difference." Bernard sat with that. "Women who have lived a full life," Marcus continued, and he said this with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about it. "They don't want a man who claims he has no regrets. That's not honesty, that's performance. But they also don't want a man who is consumed by the past. They want someone who has carried the weight, knows what it cost, and is still standing, still present." He paused. "You gave her that, without knowing you were giving it." "She said there would be another question," Bernard said. "She didn't say it directly, but I got the feeling." "There's always another question," Marcus said. "The first one tells her whether you're honest. The second one tells her whether you're still alive." Bernard did not entirely understand this at the time. He understood it completely 3 weeks later. It was a Thursday in October, cooler now, the light coming through the library window at the long angle of autumn. They had been sitting together for 2 hours, longer than usual, and the conversation had wandered through a dozen territories with the ease of 2 people who had stopped needing to manage each other. And then Celestine set down her book and looked at him directly and asked the second question. "What do you want, Bernard? Not what you're comfortable with, not what makes sense at this point in your life." She said this without apology and without softening it. "What do you actually want?" The library was quiet around them. A child was laughing somewhere in the children's section. The afternoon light lay in long, warm bars across the carpet. Bernard did not answer immediately. He had learned in 69 years that the questions that deserve real answers deserve the time to find them. What he did not want to say, what would have been the easy answer, the safe answer, the answer that would have protected him from the vulnerability of wanting something he might not get, was, "I'm fine as I am. I have what I need. I'm not looking for anything." He had said versions of that for 7 years. He had said it to his son and his pastor and his own reflection. He had said it so many times that there were days he almost believed it. He looked at Celestine, at the wire-rimmed glasses and the grey hair and the direct, waiting, entirely unfrightened eyes, and he told the truth. "I want mornings that feel like they're for something," he said. "Not just routine. I want conversations that go somewhere I didn't expect. I want—" He stopped, looked at his hands, looked back at her. "I want someone to have dinner with who I'm genuinely glad to be across the table from. I want to feel like I'm still participating in something." He paused. "I haven't let myself want that for a while. It feels strange to say it out loud." Celestine did not say, "That's sweet," or "Of course you do," or any of the comfortable reassurances that would have filled the space and diluted what he had just said. She said, "It feels strange because you've been telling yourself a story about not wanting it, and the story got very comfortable." She held his gaze steadily. "But the real answer is still there. It was just waiting for someone to ask directly enough." Bernard looked at her. "You were testing me," he said. "Not an accusation, an understanding." "I was finding out who you were," she said simply. "There's a difference. A test has a right answer. A question like that, I just wanted the true one." The week after the second question, Bernard did something he had not done in 7 years. He asked Celestine to have dinner with him. Not coffee, dinner, at a real restaurant on a real evening with the full weight of intention that the word dinner carried between two people of their age and experience. He asked simply and directly, in the parking lot of the Millbrook Public Library on a Thursday afternoon, with the October sky doing its best above the pecan trees, and he did not hedge or qualify or offer her an easy exit in the phrasing. Celestine said yes, the way she said most things, without ceremony but with complete conviction. They went to a small Italian place on the east side of town that had been there since the 1970s and had never bothered to update its decor, which meant dark wood and candles in wine bottles and a menu that had not changed significantly since Gerald Ford was president, all of which suited them both perfectly. They talked for 3 hours. Bernard had forgotten, had genuinely, completely forgotten, what it felt like to be in conversation with someone who was fully present, who asked questions because she wanted the answers, who laughed at things that were actually funny rather than at things that were socially required to be funny, who said uncomfortable true things without cruelty and received uncomfortable true things without defensiveness. He talked about Patricia more than he expected to. Celestine did not flinch from it. She asked about her, actually asked what she had been like, what their life had been, what Bernard missed most. And Bernard answered with the honesty he had been practicing since the library armchair, and found that talking about Patricia in this way, fully, honestly, to someone who genuinely wanted to know, felt not like disloyalty, but like its opposite, like honoring her, like carrying her forward into the life he was still living, rather than sealing her away in a room he never opened. The second question, Bernard said, somewhere in the second hour. "What would you have done if I'd said I was fine as I am, that I didn't want anything more?" Celestine considered this. "I would have believed you," she said, "and I would have stopped being in the library on Thursdays." "That simply?" "That simply," she said, "a man who has genuinely made peace with a small life. There's nothing wrong with that. But I'm not interested in persuading someone into wanting more. Either it's there or it isn't. She looked at him over her glasses. It was there. I could see it before you could say it. How? The way you talked about your boys, she said. Not the wins. You kept coming back to the individuals. This one's mother was sick. That one struggled to read. You remembered all of them by their specific details, not their positions on the field. A man who notices people that carefully? She paused. That's not a man who is done participating. That's a man who has been waiting for something worth participating in. Bernard was quiet for a moment. You saw all of that from the library, he said. I'm a retired art teacher, she said. I spent 30 years teaching people to look at what's actually there rather than what they expect to see. It becomes a habit. Outside the restaurant, the October night was clear and cool and full of stars in the way of small southern towns far enough from city lights to still have a real sky. Bernard drove Celestine to her car in the library parking lot. They had met there, which had been her suggestion and which he now understood was a measured choice. The choice of a woman who trusted her own judgment but had also been around long enough to take things in the right order. She got out of the car and turned back. Same time next Thursday? She said. The library or dinner? Bernard asked. She smiled, the real one, full and unguarded. Both, she said, in that order. He called Marcus on the drive home. She asked me 2 questions, Bernard said. The first one about regret, the second one about what I wanted. And, Marcus said, I answered honestly both times. Bernard merged onto Route 9, the pecan trees dark on either side. She said she would have stopped coming to the library if I'd given her the comfortable answer. Marcus was quiet for a moment. She was finding out if you were whole, he said. Same thing I told you. You were right, Bernard said, but it's more than that. He thought about how to say it. The first question, it was about the past, whether I had made peace with it without pretending it didn't cost anything. The second question was about the future, whether I still had one I was willing to claim. He paused. She wasn't testing whether I had the right answers. She was testing whether I had the courage to say the real ones. Did it feel like a test? Marcus asked. No, Bernard said. It felt like someone finally asking what I actually thought. That's what a good question feels like, Marcus said. Bernard drove through the October night with the stars above the pecan trees and Hank waiting at home, and the specific, unfamiliar, not entirely comfortable feeling of a man who has been settled for a long time and has just discovered that settled and finished are not the same thing. He had coached boys for 30 years. He had built them up by asking the right questions at the right time, not the questions with easy answers, but the ones that required a boy to reach past what was comfortable and find out what was actually true about himself. He had never expected to be on the receiving end of that particular gift. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet car. He thought about 2 questions, about the courage it took to ask them and the courage it took to answer them, and the way that courage, exchanged between 2 people honestly, built something, not a grand structure, not a bridge that would last centuries, but something real and specific and worth tending. He thought about next Thursday. He got out of the car and Hank met him at the door, and Bernard stood in his kitchen in the October night and felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular sensation of looking forward to something.